Hello, everybody. My name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we'll be discussing Russell Moore blaming conservatives for church divisions and splits. So, that's an interesting topic. There's a Christianity Today article that Russell Moore wrote. Russell Moore recently became the editor in chief over at Christianity Today, or Compromise Today, as we like to call him here at Evangelical Dark Web. And, this is one of the early articles that he's put out since becoming the EIC over there. So, interesting article. There are some decent points, but the application of his decent points is horrendous. And that's what we're going to be talking about in this video. But also, I want to make mention that 1 in 4 liberals believes that men can get pregnant. 1 in 4. And this is higher among white women who are Democrats and college educated. That's about 36%. This comes from a survey that was conducted late last month but released this month. You can check that article out over at evangelicaldarkweb.org. Articles almost every day, and you don't want to miss them. You can subscribe to that RSS feed, or you can subscribe to the Telegram. We have a Telegram now that'll be linked in the description, as well as the other socials that you can follow. Now, let's dive into the Russell Moore article. It's titled, What Church Splits Can Teach Us About a Dividing America. As in the past, one can learn about our nation's political divisions by looking at our religious ones. This is a pretty interesting premise. I like the premise, but where is he going to go with this is an obvious question. So he opens up by talking about, America is on the verge of a civil war or a national divorce between red and blue states. And he kind of compares that to the Civil War, obviously, because there's comparisons to be made there. And he talks about how the Southern Baptist Convention was started in 1845 based on a split about whether slaveholders could be appointed as missionaries. And the Southern Baptist Convention obviously decided that the Bible does not forbid slaveholders from being missionaries. Now, slave catchers, man stealers, yes, but people that inherited a system of slavery from the British Empire, not necessarily talking about them, because they weren't man stealers. So, with that said, this SBC was technically founded on correct theological grounds on that issue. Despite the fact that America did have a precedent of freeing slaves in order to do missions work. Now, that's a fun fact for another video. So on this, he says, what's relevant about this split is, first, that it happened along similar splits in almost every other American Protestant denomination, most notably the Methodists and the Presbyterians. What's also noteworthy is the time frame. These splits happened well before the actual onset of war. The Baptist split took place a full 16 years before. Again, very interesting to note that religious divisions preceded the political divisions in the sense of how much the split actually happened. A religious split preceded the political split. That's actually a pretty good observation to have made. And that's the usefulness of this article. Again, this article doesn't last long because we're about 1/3 the way in. So in those years, our churches and denominations were splitting not over the issue of the deity of Christ or the right way to baptize, but over the exact same issue dividing the country as a whole, whether to perpetuate human slavery and proliferate white supremacy. Okay, that's a little bit inserted, considering how much white supremacy was actually in the North as well as the South. And the religious divisions happened just as the political ones did, roughly along the Mason-Dixon line. Several years ago, I asked an older, lifelong Missourian minister, in my tradition, so he's saying a conservative Baptist, because Russell Moore claims to be a conservative Baptist, Why so much fighting seemed to happen in the Missouri Baptist Convention? Sure, there was fighting everywhere, but Missouri seemed to be on the edge of most places. So he's saying in the Missouri Baptist Convention pre-Civil War, there was a lot of fighting, and this guy provides an answer to that. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not a historian on the Southern Baptist Church. So this is another interesting point that he makes, and this is a point that he makes about the feasibility of national divorce. Most places split nearly along regional and political lines. If one went to a church in Massachusetts, that church, whether it was white or black, was probably abolitionist. And if one went to a white church in Alabama, almost regardless of denomination, that church was probably pro-slavery. Now again, that's a straw man. You can kind of see it that in the South, there's a rich white versus poor white divide, and the rich whites might have been a lot more pro-slavery than the average grassroots citizen was. And there was an extensive literature out there to suggest that the South was not as pro-slavery as many would make it seem. Even Robert E. Lee wasn't pro-slavery. The church split before the country did, but for all the same reasons. The only difference was that once the country came back together following the victory of the Union and the emancipation of the enslaved people, the churches remained apart. Some of them are still split more than 150 years later. And this is a more useful point that he makes right here, is this came to mind as I started paying attention to the fact that almost every church tradition in this country seems to be splintering right now. Yet this fragmentation seems quite different from the kind we saw back in the 19th century. The United Methodist Church, for instance, is undergoing a formal split into at least two different churches over the presenting issue of human sexuality. The more progressive forces are staying within the existing structure, while the more conservative ones, and again, Methodists aren't that conservative. I mean, if you believe in ordaining women, you are not a conservative denomination. That's where I'm drawing the line of whether you can call yourself conservative or not. The more conservative ones are joining with Methodists all around the world, especially the global South, to form the Global Methodist Church. Meanwhile, those whiteys are forming a liberal denomination, an even more liberal denomination in the UMC. The split makes sense to me. After all, most people would agree that division is about more than just sex. For those who, like me, are more conservative, Russell Moore's not a conservative, by the way, the issue is about the authority of Scripture. Those who are more progressive viewed it as a question of basic human rights and inclusivity. Both groups agree that the stakes, although different for each faction, are equally high, and there's no way to meet in the middle. And he's right about that. What I think he's wrong about is that he doesn't take a side in this point here. He's saying that the split is justified, not that there's a clear right and wrong. That's just Russell Moore, I guess, being Russell Moore. When it comes to the future of American democracy, though, the most interesting point is not why, but how the split is happening. So one of the points that he's making, and I guess he'll make it in a paragraph right now, is about the fact that we're not exactly split between red states and blue states as nicely as we might think. And here's where he talks to a Methodist pastor, and it's just an embarrassing what that pastor says. I asked a pastor of a large Methodist congregation what took the churches in the denomination so long to figure out that they must go in different directions. He responded, "You're looking at this wrong. A lot of people do. People think that there are conservative churches and progressive churches, and we just put one group in one denomination and the other in another, then we're all happy. You're wrong. Most congregations are not blue or red, if you want to use partisan political analogy," he said. Most of the conservative congregations are 30% progressive, and most of the progressive denominations are 30% conservative. We're not talking about a dividing line that goes down the middle of a denomination, but a dividing line that going down the middle of almost every individual church. And he might be right about that. He's right about that, but where the Methodist pastor is just terrible here is in the next part. After that conversation, I started asking different questions of my Methodist friends. I asked one group of pastors, when the Methodist church splits, where are your congregations going? One answered, 30% of my congregation wants to stay, but 30% wants to leave, and 30% just wants everybody to get along. 10% don't know that anything's going on. Many others nodded. I Freudian slip. I'm sure that was a boring conversation. I then asked, so what are y'all going to do? One of the pastors quipped, take an early retirement, and the others laughed and said amen. I'm not sure they were joking, which is cowardly. There's a clear right and wrong answer to whether a church should perform gay weddings or have gay pastors. I think that's what the Methodists are splitting over. I don't think the Methodist Church has been good on the issue of homosexuality since like the early 70s. Like they've been bad on that issue for several decades now. It's not exactly a new shift. They're side A theology. They're not flirting with side B theology like the PCA or the Evangelical Covenant Church. Yet their situation tracks with the state of the country, perhaps not in the reason for the division, but in how it is playing out. As many have pointed out, the idea that blue states and red states is not really accurate. California is blue, but what about Bakersfield? Texas is red, but what about Austin? Washington is blue, but what about Spokane? Louisiana is red, but what about New Orleans? And that reality is not just about urban areas in primarily rural states or the reverse. Now, I live in Maryland, and I can tell you that the Republican Party in Maryland is fairly liberal. I live in a rural county, and the Republicans here are left of center. So how true is that really? He can say that, but I'm sure there are areas of this country in rural red states where the Democrats are actually to the right of the Republicans in blue states. I would bet money on that. This is why those who study civil wars and national breakdowns are warning us that a national divorce could indeed happen, but it won't look like the firing on Fort Sumter. Instead, many of them say it could look much more like Northern Ireland of past years, with violent outbreaks and insurgencies and the sort of division that can't be charted on a map. I think Bobby Lopez talked about the English Civil War as an analogy for how a Civil War II would play out in the United States. That was when I had him on for an interview. Go check that out. In that sense, maybe the warning for our future is not in the split up of the United Methodist Church, even with all its local complexities. Maybe it's a warning about what's happening in almost every other denomination. And here is where we shift. So what you read was not so terrible, right? Other than the fact that he does not take a side on very obvious theological divides. He doesn't take a side because, again, this is Christianity or compromise today he's writing for. He's not going to take a side on homosexuality in the church. Now, here's where he will take a side. In many denominations and churches, the ones who are fueling the division don't necessarily want to win or govern anything. They simply wish to channel their rage at existing institutions and express contempt at the real or imagined elites. Unlike the debates over sexual morality or biblical inerrancy, these insurgencies are usually not about theology or missions, but the very secular forces fracturing this country. But wait, there's more. For more conservative and evangelical churches or denominations, such insurgencies are often composed of ethno-nationalist alt-right identity politics and or resentment of norms and institutions that have held the groups together. How well these groups navigate the situation is determined largely by the way their leaders react. So he's basically saying that, he's trying to say that white nationalists or white people that so happen to be nationalists or white supremacists might be the most correct way to put it, are the people that are dividing the church. But really, name one prominent white supremacist that is creating an insurgency in the church. Point these people out. Are you going to call Tom Buck a white supremacist? I shouldn't say white nationalist. That's a bogus term. Are you going to call the Conservative Baptist Network white supremacist? I mean, if they were white supremacists, they might actually have more conviction than they currently do, which is just how little I think of the Conservative Baptist Network. You should see my video or my live stream that I did where I talked about my vote of no confidence in their insurgency of the Southern Baptist Convention. But you see the elitism here. Russell Moore is an elite. He's an elite because he has clout with secular media, and that's basically the biggest reason. And then he also has clout within the people that want to be liked by the world love Russell Moore. And he's blaming conservatives. I mean, this is just a euphemism. That paragraph right there, for more conservatives in evangelical denominations, the insurgencies are composed of ethno-national alt-right identity politics. He's talking about conservatives. He can try to blackwash conservatives all he wants, but he's talking about the theological and political conservatives. I think I heard the word SAGCON used. Socially aware is some sort of acronym about your theologically and politically conservative. And he's talking about those people. And the people that say we don't want critical race theory in our church. We don't want feminism in our church. We don't want side B theology in our church. And, Rachel Den Hollander theology in our church either. He's talking about those people. Let's be real. The people that think voting Democrat is a sin because, for obvious reasons. In some church groups, leaders recognize that they must distinguish between those who dissent from some aspect of church life, an objection that should be respected and protected, and those who are, in reporter Amanda Ripley's memorable words, conflict entrepreneurs. I don't know who Amanda Ripley is. In churches or denominations where leaders prioritize their positions or pensions, as is the case in much of the country's civil arenas, such insurgents will be appeased. This is especially true for leaders who are nihilistic, since they will do or say anything. I don't think that's what nihilism means. Or I don't think that someone being nihilistic will lead to them being a complete sellout. This has more to do with someone who's weak, not nihilistic. Because a nihilist could just be completely indifferent to these grumblings, I guess. But here's the thing. Let's actually be bold for a second here. The Branch Covidians dominated the church in 2020 and 2021. They dominated the church. And there was much grumbling, in the pews because the laities, the laymen knew that if these church leaders don't think the church is essential, many people left the church entirely. Many people just said, we're going to find pastors that do believe that church is essential. That's what happened in 2020 and 2021. These ghost mega churches that are seeing fractions of what they saw pre-COVID is because they locked down, they told their congregations they weren't essential. And so their congregations went to it, either said, okay, I guess church isn't essential, or they went and found a real church that was meeting. That's what happened. And these churches are being called, oh, you're giving into MAGA theology. I saw a tweet about that earlier tonight. And it's like, no, people want conviction. Conviction is a selling point for a church. It just is. You can use seeker-sensitive movement, or you can have conviction. Those are two ways to grow a church. And Russell Moore clearly peddled the Branch Covidian line. This hobbit is vaccinated. I will never forget that tweet from Russell Moore. And it just, again, the people who are against the locking down of the church had a legitimate grievance. The people that were more focused on their pensions were the people that were locking down the church. Are those people really MAGA types? Are those people giving in to the MAGA movement? No. They were actually giving in to the World Economic Forum movement, the Great Reset movement. The Branch Covidian cult is what they were giving into. They weren't giving into ethno-nationalist alt-right identity politics. So it's just a really dumb thing for Russell Moore to say. And along the lines, he's saying that people who are fighting for the church have no interest in actually leading the church. I don't think that's true. In fact, I'm less convinced that they are interested in leading the church. I'm actually more unconvinced that they're interested in actually fighting for the church. And that's mostly talking about the Conservative Baptist Network. They're not interested in fighting for the church. I think they are interested in governing. Churches and denominations that will overcome all of this are those that believe there is higher accountability, the judgment seat of Christ, and the authority of Scripture. For them, what matters is not just who wins or loses, but what sorts of personal character and integrity mark those who win or lose. I fully expect the United States is resilient enough to overcome its present divisions and to conserve democracy for generations to come. But it won't happen by pretending will just occur on its own, or that some imagined superheroes will rescue us. Such a feat will take, as it has before, citizens who are willing to stand up for norms and rules and institutions that have kept the country together thus far. You mean the institutions that are all broken, like the banks, like the schools, like the churches, like the government, like corporations? All these things are tearing the entire country apart and driving the division. They're clearly broken, but he wants to presuppose that we need to actually fight to keep these institutions alive. No. Burn them. In the meantime, if we want to know where the country is heading, perhaps we should pay attention not just to the fact that our churches are splitting, but to how they are splitting. And again, that line is pretty good at the end. The problem is he just blamed conservatives for the churches dividing, which is totally Russell Moore. You got to punch right. Never mind the people. The Bible blames church divisions on the people who are in error. The people that want to bring homosexuality into the United Methodist Church are the ones causing division in that church. Now, again, the people that all of a sudden want to leave the Methodist Church because they've been pro-homosexuality for decades, those people lack self-awareness, admittedly, but they're not the ones causing division. They just lack self-awareness. There's a difference. So anyway, that's our that's our dive into the latest cringe from Russell Moore blaming, I almost wanted to call this, he wants to blame white people for church divisions, but that's not entirely what just happened. It was conservatives, not white people. Not just white people. Anyway, have a blessed day. I will catch you on the next one.